بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. محاضرتنا اليوم في الأناتومي هي the nose. The nose is one of the important features of the face. First thing we discuss with you is the development of the nose. We have nose developed from frontonasal processes, which grows between primitive forebrain and the somodium. The frontonasal processes are divided into median nasal processes and two lateral processes. The primitive nasal cavity are closed at their posterior end by bucco-nasal membrane, which rupture and form the caponium. The clinical significance, the capenia epiraceae. The olfactory lacus on the frontonasal process, which become depressed to form olfactory pits, which later form the nasal cavity. This figure shows the roof of somodium of a 12 human embryo, illustrating the development of the primitive palate and posterior nares by approximation of maxillary process to lateral and medial nasal folds. The previous site of attachment of buccopharyngeal membrane is represented by a dotted line, and part of late maxillary process has been removed after Hamilton and Mossman. Now we start with the anatomy of the nose. The nose is the upper part of the respiratory tract. The external nose is a feature of the nose. The nostrils, or nares, on the inferior aspect of the external nose lead to the nasal cavity. حقيقة فتحة الأنف تقع في قاع الهرمي of the الأنف. The nasal cavity is about 6 to 7 cm in length anterior-posteriorly and 2 cm wide inferiorly, and tapered to narrow with 0.5 cm superiorly. The external feature of the nose, the first upper part of the nose is the root, or call it nasion, of the nose, is a point in the skull where the nasal and frontal bone unites. Is located at about the level of eyebrows. The firm, narrow part between the eyes is a bridge, called it dorsum nasi, of the nose, and is formed by union of nasal bones. The nose below this level has a pliable cartilaginous framework that maintains an opening. The tip of the nose called the apex of the nose. So as you see in this figure, from up downward, the root of the nose, the bridge of the nose, the apex of the nose. We have two nostrils, and at the side of nostril, other nasal sulcus. There are two nostrils at the side of nasal septum. The nostril or external nares are the paired opening to the nose. The wing, called ala of the nose, forms the flared outer margin of each nostril. Nasal sulcus, lateral depression where the ala of the nose contracts the tissue of the face. The external feature of the nose first starts with the root at the call it nasion, and then the bridge of the nose at the dorsum nasi and nasofacial angle, then the apex, the ala nasi, the other nasal sulcus, and anterior part, nearest nostril, nasal septum, and the lower part of the nose is the lip, is philtrum of the lip. The function of the nose and nasal cavity are for respiration, for breathing the air and through the nose. Olfaction for smear any odor that enter with the ear. Filtration of particular matter that have a faciali and the distillae filtration of the air that enter from it. Humidification of inspired air. The important thing in humidification of the air that enter to the lung. The reception of secretion from communication, paranasal air sinus, and from nasolacrimal duct of the orbit. That is the function of the nasal cavity. The boundaries of the nasal cavity. Superiorly, the nasal cavity is separated from the inferior cranial fossa by the perforated cribriform plate of ethmoid bone. Lying atop the cribriform plate are olfactory bulbs, which receive filament of the olfactory nerve from the mucosa of the roof of the nasal cavity. So, it is the upper part of the nasal cavity. Laterally, at the upper half is the ethmoidal air sinus, and lateral to it is the medial wall of the orbital cavity. At lower half is maxillary air sinuses. So, laterally by two parts of the skull. The upper part is the ethmoidal air sinuses, lower half maxillary air sinuses. From inferior view, inferiorly the oral cavity and the heart palate separating the nasal cavity above and the oral cavity below. So the heart palate that have from inferior view of the nasal cavity and have separated the nasal cavity from above and the oral cavity from below. Now, from posterior view, posteriorly communicate with the nasopharynx through the posterior nasal apparatus. That connection with the nasopharynx from posterior view. Anteriorly, the nerves lead inward to slightly dilated area called vestibule, which is lined with the skin and contains coarse hairs that can see at the opening of the nostrils. The skin covering the lower part of external nose is adherent to underlying structures and contains many large subcutaneous glands. And sensory innervation is by the infratrochlear, external nasal, and infraorbital nerve, and its arterial supply is through branch of facial, ophthalmic, and infraorbital branch of maxillary artery. The venous drainage is into facial, ophthalmic vein, and lymphatic drainage into submandibular lymph nodes. The vestibule construct posteriorly as it leads to respiratory portion of the nasal cavity. This construction marks the transition from skin of the vestibule to respiratory mucosa of the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity consisting of bony walls covered with respiratory pseudo-stratified squamous radiated columnar epithelium. This type of epithelium of respiratory system is ciliated columnar epithelium. The medial wall has a midline portion and it is divided into two portions by the septum are generally unequal because the septum deviated to one side or other side. It is formed by two parts. The first part is the bony part and second part is the cartilaginous part. The bony part is from two bones, the vomer and perpendicular plate of ethmoidal bone. We have the upper part of the nasal septum is the vomer bone, contribute to posterior inferior portion of the bony septum. It has two alli, and posteriorly articulate, superiorly with the body of sphenoid bone, inferiorly with the heart palate, above with perpendicular plate of ethmoidal bone, and anteriorly with the cartilaginous part of the septum. The upper part of the nasal septum is perpendicular plate of ethmoidal bone, contribute to the anterior superior portion of bony septum. In addition, various bony contribute in small way to the septum with midline projection or crests. This includes nasal crest of frontal bone, nasal bones, and sphenoid bones above, and nasal crest of maxilla and palatine bone below. The cartilage part of the nasal septum is septal cartilage, represents the movable portion of the septum which is quadrilateral in shape. The roof from anterior to posterior consists of lateral nasal cartilage, anterior sloping part of nasal bone, the nasal spine of frontal bone, middle horizontal part of cribriform plate of ethmoidal bone, posterior sloping part mostly from the body of sphenoid bone, that it is the roof of the nasal cavity. The floor. The floor is wider than the roof and consists of hard palate bone with the nasal crest as a sharp ridge of bone for attachment is convent of septal cartilage. The two palatal processes of maxilla contribute to the anterior two-thirds and two horizontal plate of palatine bone contribute to posterior one-third of the hard palate. The floor of the nose cavity is convex in a mediolateral direction. This figure shows the cartilaginous part of the nasal cavity. Now we have the lateral wall. It is formed mostly by nasal bone, maxilla, ethmoid bone, palatine bone, sphenoid bone, and inferior conchae bone. The posterior part of it is formed by perpendicular plate of palatine bone and medial trigodic plate of the sphenoid bone that have forming the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. We have three overhanging projections, each of which consists of chord plate of bone. We have superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae. These have two bones. The first, related to the ethmoidal bone, have superior and middle conchae, and the last one is a bone structure is inferior nasal conchae. This conchae, they divide the lateral wall into three horizontal channels: superior, middle, and inferior meatus. The part above the superior conchae is sphenoethmoidal recess. This space that's located in the roof of the nasal cavity and the upper surface of the superior conchae. On the lateral wall of middle meatus, a curved groove, hiatus seminaris, running forward and upward to continue into passage called ethmoidal infundibulum. The bulge above the hiatus is bulla ethmoidalis, while the lower boundary of hiatus is insect process of ethmoidal bone. The anterior nasal apparatus are bounded by maxilla, while the posterior nasal apparatus are bounded above by body of sphenoid bone, below by posterior part of the hard palate, laterally medial trigoted plate of sphenoid bone. The cartilaginous of the nose consists of 5 pieces: the 2 upper and 2 lateral cartilage, and the cartilaginous of the septum, call it septal cartilage. Each of these bones are triangular and in shape. These various cartilages are connected to each other via fiber membrane that allow to the nose to move freely. Now we discuss the nasal mucosa. Immediately above the nostril, the septum is slightly concave where it forms the medial wall of vestibule of the nose, the skin of which carries a number of stiff hairs for clearing of the air when entered through nasal cavity from any foreign particles. The remainder of septum is covered with a mucous membrane, that epithelium of which is pseudo-stratified columnar ciliated epithelium. It is tightly adherent to the underlying periosteum and pericardium, mucoperiosteum and mucopericardium. The lower large area is known as respiratory region, and upper third is called olfactory region. So the mucosa divided in two regions. Lower larger area is respiratory region, and upper smaller area is olfactory region. The olfactory region is epithelium contains the olfactory nerve cell. The olfactory mucous membrane is more delicate and yellowish in fresh state. The respiratory mucous membrane is thick, spongy, and highly vascular. It contains numerous mucous glands. It is capable of swelling to a considerable thickness when the vascular space in it are filled with blood. It also contains many arteriovenous anastomosis that increase the flow of blood through it to warm the air passing over it. The innervation of the mucosa. Generally, sensory nerves are a bunch of either ophthalmic nerve or maxillary nerve division of trigeminal cranial 50 cranial nerve. The first division is ophthalmic nerve and second division is maxillary nerve. The innervation that have from ophthalmic division of trigeminal nerve, first the anterior ethmoidal nerve that have from V1 arise from the nasociliary branch of ophthalmic nerve, which in the orbit, which pass medially through the anterior ethmoidal canal of the orbital wall to supply the anterior ethmoidal air sinuses. The nerve continue medially to enter the anterior cranial fossa and the exit through ethmoidal canal anterior to cribriform plate to roof of the nasal cavity, and here the nerve divided into internal branch pass to lateral wall, then run on the anterior superior part of the nasal septum. The external nasal branch continue downward on the internal aspect of the nasal bone to exit into the external nose as the external nasal nerve to supply the skin over anterior part of the nasal bridge. The other innervation, nasal branch of infraorbital nerve from second division of trigeminal nerve, supply skin of the ala of the nose, and internal branch penetrates to the vestibule to supply the skin of the vestibule and the movable portion of the nasal septum. The nasal branch of anterior superior nerve, again from maxillary division of trigeminal nerve. The anterior superior nerve presenting in its canal in the anterior wall of maxillary sinus. It gives off the internal nasal branch that passes to nasal cavity just below the inferior concha. It supplies mucosa of anterior portion of the inferior meatus. The posterior superior lateral nasal nerve, short sphenopalatine nerve from the cranial, fifth cranial nerve, arise from pterygopalatine ganglion and pass medially through the sphenopalatine foramen to supply the posterior two-thirds of the lateral wall of the nose. It is the third from mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. Posterior inferior lateral nasal branch rises from greater palatine branch of pterygopalatine ganglion at descent in canal. The branch leaves the canal to supply the inferior posterior lateral aspect of the nasal wall. The nasopalatine nerve logisphenopalatine nerve from the second division of trigeminal nerve from axillary nerve, which is long, slender nerve arises from pterygopalatine ganglion and enter the nasal cavity to sphenopalatine foramen and run medially across the roof of the nasal cavity and then inferiorly to the floor of the nose in a groove on the surface of the vomer. It then traverses the incisive canal and median incisive foramen with its follow-up to supply the mucous membrane in the anterior part of the hard palate in the premaxillary area. The special sense that have smell. The olfactory mucosa contains bipolar olfactory cells. Peripheral processes pass to the mucosal surface as hair-like smell receptor ending. The central processes pass upward as approximately 20 bundles of the filaments, call it olfactory nerve proper. This filament bundle passes through the cribriform plate and ends by synapsing in the olfactory pulse with ganglion cells. Central processes of the ganglionic cell pass backward to brain through the olfactory tract and through the olfactory nerve. Other innervation is autonomic nervous supply. There are parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous supply to the gland of the nasal mucosa arise from postganglionic fiber of ciliary ganglion traveling with the anterior ethmoidal nerve and from postganglionic fiber of pterygopalatine ganglion traveling with the posterior lateral nasal and nasopalatine nerves. The blood supply of the nose. The mucosa of the nasal cavity receives a rich blood supply from several sources that anastomosis freely. The important and largest artery are sphenopalatine branch of maxillary artery and anterior ethmoidal branch of ophthalmic artery. In addition, a small nasal branch of superior lateral branch of facial artery and from orbital artery. The blood supply of the septum from anterior ethmoidal artery, posterior ethmoidal artery, and from sphenopalatine artery is a branch of maxillary artery. And the other branches from small branches from greater palatine artery and from superior labial artery, that branch of facial artery. The venous drainage. The veins return collect as a plexus from which vein drain to ophthalmic vein, pterygoid plexus, facial vein, and infraorbital vein. Lymphatic drainage. The lymphatic drainage from the posterior part of lateral wall is retropharyngeal lymph node, and from the anterior part and the septum to submandibular nodes. Thank you for your listening in this lecture.